there are few stories as strange as the disappearance of the Eilean Mor Lightkeepers. The vanishing of these three men has sparked numerous theories as to what became of them. But to this day, the fate of the missing men remains unknown. In December of 1900, the Eilean Mor Lighthouse stood like a quiet sentinel on Scotland's western coast, a crucial navigation tool for the ships that sailed those dangerous waters. It was maintained by a team of 4 men, with 3 men on duty and 1 man ashore on leave. The 3 lightkeepers on duty were James Duckett, the principal lightkeeper, Thomas Marshall, the assistant lightkeeper, and Donald MacArthur, known as an occasional lightkeeper, meaning he was filling in for an absent colleague. The 4th lightkeeper, a man named Joseph Moore, was ashore on leave at the time of the incident. These lightkeepers lived together in extremely close quarters, for weeks at a time, in near total isolation from the rest of the world. It was enough to drive some men insane. But these were experienced lightkeepers, men who understood the importance of their duties and took their job very seriously. That job was to keep the beacon light burning, come hell or high water. The lighthouse beacon light played an essential role in maritime traffic. Without it, ships sailing at night or in bad weather would have no way of knowing their proximity to the coastline and could drift inland without realizing it, smashing their hulls on the jagged coastal rocks. It was essential that the beacon light be on at all times. But on the night of December 15th, for no apparent reason, the light went out on Ailen Mor. That night, a passing ship noted in its log that the Ailen Mor beacon light had been turned off in poor weather. The ship's captain reported the inactive beacon when he arrived in port, and lighthouse authorities began investigating the incident immediately. They wanted to know exactly how and why the light had gone out, and why the 3 lightkeepers had failed in their duties. But in 1900, the Ailen Mor Lighthouse had no direct means of communication with the mainland. Contact with shore was limited to scheduled relief and visits from supply ships, typically every 2 weeks when weather allowed. Since there was no way to contact the lighthouse from shore, a supply ship headed to the island was told to investigate the incident and report its findings to the authorities. Joseph Moore, the 4th lightkeeper, was ashore on leave when the beacon light was reported out. The lighthouse authorities ordered him to investigate when he returned to the island on December 20th, but bad weather delayed his departure for another week. It was not until December 26th, 11 days after the beacon light went dark, that the supply ship sailed for Ailen Mor. When the supply ship finally arrived, Joseph Moore fully expected to see his fellow lightkeepers waiting for them at the landing. It was custom for lightkeepers to do so when the supply ship arrived, and after being trapped on that small and barren island for so long, the 3 men should have been overjoyed to see their relief approaching. But as the supply ship neared the lighthouse, the landing remained empty, and Moore was met with only an eerie silence. The supply boat captain blew the ship's horn and sent up a warning flare, but there was no response. Puzzled by the unsettling quiet, Moore rowed ashore in a small landing boat to investigate. He secured the boat to the dock, and there he saw that no provision boxes were set out on the landing for restocking. He then began the long climb up the steep steps cut into the cliff, and by his own account, felt a deep sense of dread as he ascended those stairs towards the dark lighthouse. When he arrived at the entrance, Moore immediately knew something was wrong. The door was unlocked, and in the entrance hall, 2 of the 3 oilskin jackets used by the lightkeepers were missing. This raised some interesting questions. Why was there only 1 jacket, while the other 2 were unaccounted for? And why had one of the keepers ventured outside into the bitter cold without his oilskin jacket? Disturbed by the missing clothing, Moore felt increasingly uneasy as he continued his search. In the kitchen area, he discovered the silverware cleaned and put in its place, finding nothing out of the ordinary there. The sleeping quarters appeared in good order, though the beds were unmade. Moore noted that the oil lamps had been cleaned and refilled, and that their pet canary sat quietly in its cage. But he noticed that, strangely, the lighthouse clock had stopped. Moving on, he began the long climb up the winding stairs to the lightroom, calling the names of the missing men. Inside the empty lightroom, everything seemed in order, except for one detail. The lens of the beacon light had been cleaned but not covered, as per regulations, suggesting the lightkeeper's work had been interrupted. but there was still no sign of the missing men. Mor completed his search of the lighthouse and the surrounding island, but found no further traces of his colleagues. He later said, "I did not take the time to search further, for I only too well knew something serious had occurred. So I darted out and made for the ship back at the landing." Following Mor's report of the missing lightkeepers, the ship's captain quickly organized a search of the surrounding islands, but to no avail. The captain hastily sent a telegram back to the mainland, which read, "A dreadful accident has happened. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there, no sign of life was to be seen. Night coming on, we could not wait to make something as to their fate. I have left Moore, MacDonald, and 2 seamen on the island to keep the light burning until you make other arrangements." The supply ship left the island soon after, and the 4 unlucky men remained behind to man the lighthouse. Theories about what happened ranged widely. Some said the men were eaten by a giant sea monster. Others theorized kidnapping by foreign agents, or the vengeance of a ghost, reputed to guard the island of Ailen Mor against intruders. One popular theory was that one of the missing lightkeepers murdered the other men before taking his own life by jumping into the ocean. This speculation was directed at MacArthur, the occasional lightkeeper, who was the least experienced and known for his temperamental nature. Instances of lighthouse keepers losing their sanity were not uncommon. In the 1800s, lighthouse keepers had a reputation for losing their minds, where it was assumed that the crushing loneliness and isolation drove them to madness. But that may not always have been the case. The Fresnel lens, created by French physicist Augustin Fresnel, was a breakthrough in beacon light technology. It made lighthouses brighter and therefore safer for ships, but it came with a hidden cost. To keep the massive glass lens turning smoothly, it was set to float on a thin layer of liquid mercury. The system worked perfectly, until dust or grit got into the metal. Then the keepers had to strain the mercury by hand through fine cloth to extract the contaminants. What they didn't know at the time was that mercury is a highly poisonous substance. Prolonged exposure attacks the nervous system, causing tremors, hallucinations, and eventually insanity. It was poisoning by mercury that drove 19th century hat makers mad. And with that in mind, it's entirely possible the lighthouse keepers were slowly being poisoned and driven mad by the very light they tended so carefully. Could it have been the case, then, that MacArthur went mad from mercury poisoning and murdered his fellow lightkeepers? Lighthouse officials disagreed with that theory. A few days after the men were reported missing, the lighthouse superintendent, a man named Robert Muirhead, was sent to Ailen Mor to investigate. There he discovered that the west landing showed clear signs of recent storm damage. A supply box sitting 100 feet above sea level was smashed open, its contents scattered. Iron railings were bent flat, the narrow rail line along the path was torn from its concrete bed, and a rock weighing more than a ton had been shifted. Above it all, on the cliff top more than 200 feet above the sea, turf was ripped away up to 30 feet from the edge, evidence that the waves reached far higher than expected. In fact, the destruction from the storm was so bad, the superintendent noted in his report that the damage was difficult to believe unless actually seen. It was later determined that the men likely left from the lighthouse for an unknown reason in poor weather conditions, possibly to retrieve equipment or assess any potential damage. After examining the clothing left inside the lighthouse, Muirhead determined that Ducat and Marshall had gone down to the western landing, while MacArthur, the occasional lightkeeper, left later during heavy rain, wearing only his shirt. That matters because whoever is last to leave the light leaves it unattended, a direct violation of official lighthouse rules. Marshall had previously been fined 5 shillings after his equipment was washed away in a storm. It's possible that, to avoid another penalty, he and Ducat went out during a storm to secure the gear and were swept into the sea. MacArthur was required to remain behind to man the lighthouse, but it's possible he saw a large wave headed for his colleagues and left the lighthouse to warn or assist the others before being taken by the waves as well. An official investigation concluded that when the men had gathered on the landing, a massive wave rose up and swept the men away. In fact, it's entirely possible they were surprised on the landing by a rogue wave. A rogue wave rises from the ocean without warning, towering far above the surrounding swells like a moving wall of water. Unlike normal waves, which follow predictable patterns, a rogue wave appears suddenly. Its immense energy concentrated in a single, devastating surge. Sailors have described them as monstrous, almost supernatural, capable of swallowing ships whole or smashing vessels with terrifying force. They seem to come from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. A fleeting but lethal giant born from deep within the ocean. In official lighthouse registries, there are entries for Ducat and Marshall. A red ink notation states that they vanished around December 15, 1900, and all three men are listed with probably drowning as the cause of death. But there were still lingering questions. Why had the men breached protocol by leaving the lighthouse unattended? What had driven the men to stand all together at the landing? Why was one man without his coat in freezing December weather? And how could all three experienced lightkeepers have been caught unawares by the same giant wave? In the years that followed, lighthouse keepers at Ailen Mor shared stories of eerie experiences, like hearing mysterious voices in the wind, softly calling out the names of the three men who disappeared. Some keepers came to believe the lighthouse was indeed cursed. A replacement keeper for Joseph Moore fell to his death from that lighthouse, while another succumbed to madness. Additionally, William Ross, one of the original keepers who was on leave during the mysterious event, tragically perished while on duty at another lighthouse. Whether the Ailen Mor Lighthouse is cursed is a matter of opinion, but the fact remains that despite the theories, the disappearance of those three lightkeepers remains a lingering mystery. It's as if someone or something stole them away from the lighthouse, never to be seen or heard from again.